All right, so in our class now, we have finished reading through portions of exegeting orality. We have read through Longnecker's biblical exegesis in the apostolic period. We have read through Moises' Old Testament in the New, an introduction. We've read an article by Peter Perry. We've watched a discussion on oral traditional cultures. We've had our own discussions in our forums. So we are starting to move now out of the information phase into the analyzing and reproducing our own thoughts on the subject phase. And before we launch fully into that, into reading now our book, Three Views on the New Testament's Use of the Old Testament, where we're going to look at these other approaches and process through our own approaches and write exegetical papers and produce kind of our own theories on the New Testament's use of the Old Testament. I just want to go through real quick and see if we can knock out a few clarifying points on the oral traditional approach. Honestly, guys, I've been very impressed with how well you guys are processing this information, how you're receiving it and receiving it critically. I love that. You're not taking it on wholesale. You're also not just automatically rejecting it because it's something that seems fairly new. Quickly, I want to see if I can add some qualifications so we don't replace an overly textual model with an overly simplified oral model, and just talk about how oral traditional criticism does expand our historical model, and it does not eliminate the need for evidence and interpretive control. So the first point I want to address is, one way to say it is that oral and written are not competing worlds. Another way to say it really is to join in the conversation in the field is maybe we need a better word than orality. But man, you know how slow it's been for biblical studies to pick up on these conversations at all. I think it's going to be a lot longer before we move away from the word orality. We're about to start a new phase in Stark College and Seminary, and it's going to be like an orality track. And we'll probably use that word orality for a while. Even in the mission field, though, they're looking more at oral preference learners instead of just calling it orality, because the issue is really it's less a competition between oral communication as it is cultural assumptions. Communal traditional cultures hold their traditions as a community, and they hold it as their identity. And since they aren't hyper individualized, they're not hyper pluralistic cultures. All of these things it's play in to these cultural philosophical realities that play out in how they communicate, how they expect to communicate, how they receive their identity, how they communicate their identity through their traditions, this circumambient world that they all live in. And the biblical world was, comparatively to many cultures we would call oral traditions, had a lot of writing in it. The biblical world, especially the further you go along the timeline, it was an oral scribal ecosystem. There were scrolls. I mean, it's a big deal that things were written down. Moses has talked about writing things down. Whenever Joshua came in, they crossed the Jordan and they wrote the Torah, or they wrote the covenant on stone, which they probably didn't write. All of Deuteronomy, using activation, they could probably write specific phrases that was, the covenant, right? But whatever, writing was a part of the world, and it was an important part of the world. There were scrolls, there were public readings, there was memorization, there was teaching, there was performance, and communal retelling. All of these things interacted. We don't want to repeat the mistake of early oral traditional scholars of having this great divide between literacy and orality. Really the field is moving beyond some of that terminology. So the question is not, was this written or oral, but how did written materials function in this oral traditional cultures? That's why we move toward this word media studies. It's the media of communications. How did different cultures use the media of communications that they had? So the oral traditional approach does not remove texts from the picture. It relocates texts within their actual media environment, right? Next, I've heard a couple of you guys talk about how activation is, one little phrase from a book of the Bible activates that entire book of the Bible. Activation doesn't mean it always activates the broadest context of the phrase or word or scene or structure that's put there. Quite frankly, you know how some hyperlinks, sometimes you'll open up a whole web page and the whole web page is there, but you click on one heading and it doesn't take you to a whole nother page. It just drops down to a certain paragraph of that page. If we want to think about activation as hyperlinks, phrases, elements of the tradition can be coded to call to mind like the whole epic of the Exodus or their identity as a people in different ways, but it all depends on how that activated element is coded for what it's going to activate. Activation is selective and contextual. It might evoke a character. That character might evoke an episode or a covenantal theme or a theme of rebellion, some narrative pattern, some communal expectation. Different hearers may recognize different depths of the activation. There's literally the same activated element might activate something else in a different sect of that culture. For example, the Qumran community may have things for them that's going to activate the teacher of righteousness that will, in the Christian community, which was a Jewish sectarian community, it would activate elements about Jesus, right? And so how activation works is so specific to the culture, and that's why it's worth doing the work to figure out as much as we can what is true about the culture and the activating culture of the biblical world so that we can interpret our scriptures as well as we can, because we want to know the truth. And the truth is a person, not a set of doctrines. And we want to know him as well as we can. So we should be coming to these activating elements with humility and restraint, knowing that activation is not the automatic importation of an entire literary context necessarily. It's the evocation of relevant elements within a shared traditional world. And so we want to be humble as we come to this and ask what part of the traditional world is relevant to this particular performance. What can we be most sure of that this is activating or not? And so this point number 3 is that this idea of circumambient tradition is not simply the Hebrew Bible. And I think that we've made that point some, but just to be clear, the whole tradition, the circumambient tradition that the biblical communities, because there were different biblical communities as time moved on. The community there at the time of David had a different circumambient tradition than the community at the time of Deborah and Barak, right? And had a different circumambient tradition in the days of Habakkuk than in the time of David, right? Everything is so particular, but the circumambient tradition is not just the whole Hebrew Bible. The community's circumambient tradition is everything circulating around it and within it, shaping its understanding. So this could include scripture in different forms. That's why we have, like in Deborah and Barak, we have, hey, here's a narrative telling of how this story happened. And then we have a song of Deborah, just like in the Exodus. We have, here's how the crossing of the Red Sea happened in narrative form. And then we have a song that tells the same story. And we have multiple psalms that retell these stories in different ways. And you have to know those were not the only ways that the story was shared in the traditional setting. So there's different liturgies and prayers, songs, interpretive expansions, communal teaching, and yes, Second Temple traditions. Not every biblical tradition would be equally familiar or influential in every community. We have to consider geography, language, community, identity, patterns of worship and instruction. And yes, that sounds daunting, and I think it should. I think we should just realize this is why we cannot interpret the Old Testament the way the New Testament authors did, is because we are so far removed from that circumambient tradition. And so it wasn't just a singular universal database that just grew as time went on. It would have shifted from the Galilee area to the Judea area, from the northern kingdom to the southern kingdom. It is important to look at what is the traditions that were handed down to us by the faith community. What traditions did Jesus and his followers authorize as canon? So canon doesn't play less of a role because of an oral traditional approach to the text. I think it plays as much of a role, at least, even if the canon isn't locked down to just the Masoretic set of consonants. Yeah. So that's number 3. Number 4 is that maybe, and we've touched on this throughout this a little bit already, is maybe we shouldn't romanticize audience knowledge. We can't imagine that every ancient listener had the entire Hebrew Bible memorized. Ancient audiences probably had different levels of traditional competence. Some activations may have been obvious to nearly everyone. Others may have been recognized primarily by expert tradents or deeply immersed hearers. Of course, parents and grandparents, as they heard the performance, might help their children or other people understand it more fully. We literally see this in Nehemiah chapter 8 as Ezra stands up and reads the word, and you have these different people groups, priests and other people, translating the reading. And so recognition could occur by degrees. The point is, though, is that it was a communal event, in a way that's very different from the way that we close our doors and read text alone in our libraries, analyzing it like it's just literature. You see, that's two different worlds. Even if we don't want to romanticize it, it's still two very different ways of communicating and receiving information and all that stuff. Yeah. So number 5 is oral tradition does not make source questions disappear. Oral tradition gives us another historically important source of wording and variation, but it doesn't automatically tell us where a particular New Testament form came from. The author may have had a manuscript different than anything else we have in front of them. They may have remembered a performance that they had heard that was different than any text that we've seen. They may have inherited a circulating formulation. They may have deliberately adapted the tradition or combined several of these. So oral tradition broadens the available explanations without solving every case. So orality changes the source critical question, but it does not make source criticism totally unnecessary, although it does totally reframe how important or why those questions are important, for sure. And number 6, fluidity still requires control. And I don't know exactly how to manage controls for this. It's such a new way of thinking about understanding and defining what a text is. And the fluidity in it all of how do we understand controls when we're outside of this traditional world that exercised a traditional communal control over it. So we can't explain every unusual quotation just by saying, well, that's oral tradition. That's just as speculative as saying, well, the author just changed it for theological reasons and moving on. And so we do want to look for distinctive wording, clear elements of repetition, connected thematic coherence, clustering, parallel witnesses, and some of it is kind of subjective of what warrants real explanatory power here. Oral traditional flexibility is patterned and constrained. Faithfulness to tradition does not require exact wording, but neither does it permit unlimited variation. So fluidity is not randomness, and we do need some kind of controls. And I think that understanding how those controls are going to work as we exegete orality, that's just going to, I think that's going to be a growing part of the field. Number 7, someone said this, that they said every performance is incomplete. And that is true in one sense and not true in another. As much as you could say every performance is incomplete because no performance is going to perform the entire circumambient tradition. Also, you would say that every performance that is received is complete because it activates every part of the tradition that it means to, and it's been received by the community. And so every performance is necessarily complete. So Matthew and Luke's versions of the Lord's Prayer, we're not saying one is an incomplete piece of another, or that either one of them is an incomplete piece of one perfect original wording. They're both complete, even as they're incomplete, because they don't represent probably the full picture of the traditional way of saying that prayer. Right? Each may be a complete performance of a recognizable but flexible tradition. The tradition has stability, but its stability is not necessarily verbatim. We should not assume that a fluid version is damaged or deficient. So it's incomplete because it's not saying everything that could be said about that thing that's being performed, but it's also complete because it's giving a faithful performance of that tradition. Yeah. Number 8, a good question to ask, and maybe another place where the field just needs to grow, or that we just need to have an ongoing communal conversation about, is distinguishing intentionality of the performer from our reception as the current audience, or even the intentionality of the original performer and the original and the reception of the original audience. What were they expected to receive? I mean, Romans, a lot of people think that Romans was written to a mostly Gentile or maybe even all Gentile audience. And if that's true, how much did Paul intend to be activated in the massive amount of Old Testament tradition that he incorporated into that letter? How much did he intend, and how much was the audience capable of receiving? But then again, that could have been why Phoebe was there to perform it and explain it. And maybe that in itself, needing to be explained, would help a Gentile audience humble themselves and not say that, we don't need our Jewish roots. So, so what traditional associations were actually available to the performer and to the receiver? What did the author or performer intend to evoke? What would different hearers likely have recognized? What connections are modern interpreters discovering, or are we reading into it? All these questions are questions that we need to discuss as we realize that the text of the Bible is the product of an oral traditional culture. Yeah, so I guess in closing, I would just say the goal in acknowledging the oral traditional origins of our texts of Holy Scripture. The goal is not to replace textual exegesis with oral speculation. The goal is to interpret the biblical texts as surviving witnesses to a living traditional world that reflects the truth of God's gracious move of revealing himself to humanity and redeeming humanity from sin and death.